The wind doesn't just blow through the canyons of the Grand Canyon. It moans, it carries the weight of 1,000 secrets buried in the red dust and the jagged limestone. Imagine standing on the edge of that vast, silent abyss. The sun is dipping. Below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Beside you stands the person you trust most in the world. They ask you to step just a little closer to the ledge to see the view. You feel their hand on the small of your back. In that heartbeat, you don't realize that you aren't looking at a sunset. You're looking at your own grave. This is the story of a man who didn't just walk among us. He wore a mask so perfect, so seamless that it took decades for the world to see the predator underneath. Robert Spangler was a husband, a father, and a neighbor. But to those who knew his darkest side, he was something else entirely. He was an architect of disappearance. He was a man who viewed his own family not as people to be loved, but as inconveniences to be erased. The air in the Spangler household in 1978 didn't smell like a home. It smelled like the clinical, cold scent of a plan being executed. Nancy Spangler thought she was living a quiet, suburban life in Littleton, Colorado. She had 2 children, David and Susan. They were teenagers, full of the typical anxieties and dreams of youth. Robert, her husband, was a man of logic, a man who liked things orderly. But order, for Robert, was starting to look like an empty house. On a crisp December morning, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered, but not by a scream. It was shattered by the sound of a phone ringing at the local precinct. Robert's voice was steady, too steady. He told the dispatcher that he had come home to find a nightmare. He claimed his wife Nancy had spiraled into a dark depression. He claimed she had taken a handgun, turned it on their 2 children, and then finally, mercifully, on herself. When the investigators walked into that house, the silence was heavy. It felt like the walls were holding their breath. David was found in his bed. Susan was in hers. Nancy was slumped in a chair, a typewriter nearby with a note that seemed to scream of despair. The scene was a tableau of tragedy, a mother's mind snapping under the weight of the world. Or so it seemed. The detectives looked at Robert. He was grieving. Yes, but it was a quiet, controlled grief. There were no frantic outbursts, no collapsing in agony. He looked like a man who had already processed the end of his world before it had even happened. The forensics back then were different. They didn't have the digital eyes we have today. They saw a grieving husband and a note that looked like a confession. They closed the folder. They let Robert Spangler walk away from the blood-stained carpet of his own home, leaving his family in the earth while he stepped back into the light. But time has a way of peeling back the skin of a lie. Robert didn't stay a widower for long. He moved on with a speed that felt predatory. He found a new wife, Sharon, who was vibrant, full of life, and seemingly the perfect companion for a man looking to start over. They traveled, they hiked, they stood on the edges of the world together. But as the years turned into a decade, the cracks began to show. Sharon wasn't the submissive, quiet partner Robert required. She had a voice, she had demands. And in Robert's world, a demand was a defect. In 1993, during a trip to the Grand Canyon, a place of immense beauty and terrifying depths, and tripped. Robert told the ranger she was trying to get a better view. He said he turned his back for just a second, and when he looked again, the ledge was empty. Her body was found 160 feet below. Again, the world looked at Robert and saw a man cursed by tragedy. How could one man lose so much? How could death follow him like a shadow? The investigators in Arizona weren't as quick to look away as the ones in Colorado. They saw the pattern. They saw the coldness in his eyes when he talked about the fall. It wasn't the look of a man who had lost his soulmate. It was the look of a man who had successfully finished a difficult chore. They started digging. They went back to 1978. They looked at the typewriter note from Nancy. They looked at the angles of the wounds. The physics didn't make sense. A woman committing suicide doesn't usually shoot herself in a way that defies the natural movement of the human arm. And then there was the third wife, Donna. She had survived him, but only because she left before the accidents could start. She spoke of a man who was hollow, a man who could flip a switch and become a stranger in his own skin. As the years pressed on, Robert's health began to fail. The predator was being hunted by his own biology. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and perhaps it was the shadow of his own death. Or perhaps it was the ultimate act of ego. But Robert finally decided to stop hiding. He sat down with investigators, the very men who had been chasing his ghost for years. He sat in a chair, breathing through an oxygen tank, and he began to talk. He spoke about the morning in 1978 with the detachment of a professor lecturing on history. He admitted he didn't want the burden of a family anymore. He didn't want a divorce. It was too messy, too expensive. So he took a gun and he ended his children's lives while they were still in the fog of sleep. He described how he forced the gun into Nancy's hand to leave her fingerprints. He described how he typed that note, crafting her despair out of thin air. The room grew cold as he moved to Sharon. He described the Grand Canyon not as a place of wonder, but as a tool. He told them how he pushed her. He didn't even look down to see her hit the rocks. He just waited, timed his reaction, and then began the performance of the grieving husband once more. He was a man who had lived his entire life as a fiction, and in those final hours, he wanted the world to know how well he had played the part. He wasn't sorry. There was no remorse in his voice, only the pride of a craftsman. He had outrun the law for over 20 years. He had outlived the people he was supposed to protect. He had looked into the abyss, and instead of blinking, he had pushed everyone else into it. Robert Spangler died in prison, never truly paying the price for the lives he stole. He died in a bed, shielded from the cold wind of the canyons, while the memories of Nancy, David, Susan, and Sharon remained frozen in the moments of their terror. We like to believe that monsters are easy to spot. We want them to have sharp teeth and glowing eyes. But the true horror is that they look like us. They take us on hikes, they tuck us into bed, they promise to love us until death do us part, never mentioning that they intend to be the ones to bring that death. The Grand Canyon still stands, its depths as silent and indifferent as ever. The wind still moans through the crevices, and if you listen closely, you might hear the echoes of a truth that stayed buried for far too long. Some secrets aren't meant to be kept, but some people are built of nothing but secrets. If you found this story chilling, subscribe for more mysteries, because some cases never close.